The early morning light fell over St. Peter's Square like a golden blanket, and the whole city of Rome seemed to hold its breath. Bells rang across the Vatican, their sound soft and sacred, calling people from every corner of the world to witness. A moment in history, the inauguration of Pope Leo XIV. Flags waved in the soft wind. The marble floor of the square glistened, and thousands of visitors stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting to see the new pope appear. It was a day of deep tradition, a ceremony that had been followed for hundreds of years. Everything had to be perfect. Every step, every song, every gesture had meaning. In front of the massive basilica stood the famous Swiss guards, their bright blue, red, and yellow uniforms shining under the sunlight. They were the protectors of the Pope, known for their discipline and silence. Each man stood like a statue, their halberds held firm, their eyes forward, their faces calm. No one moved, not even to blink too often. The world watched them as symbols of strength and devotion. Among them was a young guard named Marcus Steiner. He was tall, with light brown hair hidden under his metal helmet and sharp blue eyes that had seen both hardship and hope. Marcus had been chosen for this duty after years of training. For him, this day was not only an honor but a test of loyalty. He had rehearsed every move for weeks. He knew that one mistake, one wrong step, could bring shame not only to himself but to the entire guard. The ceremony began with the sound of trumpets echoing through the square. The choir sang in Latin, their voices rising to the heavens. Cardinals in red robes walked in slow, graceful lines toward the altar. Incense floated through the air, carrying the scent of ancient prayer. The new pope, dressed in white, walked with slow dignity, followed by his attendants. Every eye turned to him, but Marcus's gaze remained straight ahead, as he had been taught. He tried to stay calm, to focus on his breathing, to block out the noise of the crowd and the excitement around him. But something in the air made him uneasy. A strange feeling stirred in his chest, like a whisper from the past that refused to be ignored. He blinked, steadying his halberd, and forced his thoughts to return to duty. The voice of the commander earlier that morning echoed in his mind. Remember, guards, no movement, no speech, no emotion. You are not men today. You are symbols of faith and honor. For most of the guards, this command was easy to follow. But for Marcus, who had lived a life full of emotion and struggle before joining, it was harder than it looked. Behind the cold uniform and straight posture, he was a man who carried a story, one that began long before this shining day in Rome. As the ceremony continued, the sunlight moved across the square, glinting off the armor of the guards and the marble statues above them. The Pope took his seat beneath the canopy, and the prayers began. Marcus's mind wandered for just a second, and in that moment, something caught his eye, a movement in the crowd. He almost ignored it, but something made him look again. In the sea of faces, near the front row of the pilgrim section, sat an elderly nun in a wheelchair. Her skin was pale, and her hands trembled as she held a small white and yellow Vatican flag. She was trying to wave it, but her arm shook weakly. Still, her eyes were alive, filled with light and devotion. And then, for one fleeting moment, those eyes met Marcus's. A chill ran through him. He felt as if time had stopped. He knew that face. Even though many years had passed, he could never forget it. It was Sister Helena, the woman who had once saved his life. Memories flooded him. He was no longer a soldier standing guard at a grand ceremony. He was a lost boy again, cold and hungry in the snowy Alps, many years ago. He remembered the sound of the wind howling over the mountains, the ache in his small legs, and the fear that no one would ever find him. He had wandered alone for days after losing his parents in a tragic accident. And then, through that snowstorm, a warm hand had found his. Sister Helena had been that hand. She had carried him to a small monastery, given him food, warmth, and care. For months, she had nursed him back to health, teaching him kindness and faith. "Never forget," she had said once, "that the greatest service to God is love." Those words had stayed in his heart even after he left the orphanage and joined the Swiss Guard years later. He had tried to find her again after becoming a soldier, but he never could. Until now his breath caught in his throat. How could she be here, of all places, on this day? She looked frail, older than he remembered, but the same gentle light still shone in her eyes. She was smiling faintly in his direction. His hands tightened on his weapon. His body stiffened as he fought to keep his composure. The rule was clear. Guards must not move or react to anyone during the ceremony. Not even the Pope himself could break their silence. But his heart was no longer steady. He wanted to look again to make sure it was really her, but he forced his eyes forward. He tried to calm himself by repeating the prayer in his mind, but the thought of her kept returning. He remembered her laughter, her kindness, her words that had shaped him. And now she was right there, just a few meters away. Marcus felt torn between duty and humanity. He had been trained to protect the Pope at all costs, to never show emotion, to never let personal feelings get in the way. Yet something inside him whispered that this was no ordinary day. Perhaps fate had brought her here for a reason. The choir changed its tone, signaling the next part of the ceremony. The Pope rose to speak, his voice deep and calm. The crowd quieted, listening to his blessing. Marcus tried to listen too, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. He saw, out of the corner of his eye, that Sister Helena was trying to raise her flag again, but her hands were trembling badly. A young boy beside her tried to help but couldn't steady her. Marcus clenched his jaw and stayed still. The rule was absolute, but the sight of her struggling was breaking something inside him. The air grew heavier, the sound of prayers echoed around him, and the world seemed to narrow down to that single fragile figure in the crowd. He felt something deep inside, not disobedience, but compassion. A quiet, unstoppable urge to protect. Marcus took a slow breath, trying to push the feeling away. Not now, he told himself silently. Not here. He didn't know that within the next few minutes, fate would test him more than any commander ever had done. As the Pope continued his blessing, Marcus's mind was at war. One side of him was a soldier, bound by oath and discipline. The other was the boy who had once been saved by a kind nun on a snowy night. The boy who had learned that true strength was not silence, but love. He didn't know what was about to happen next, but deep down, he felt it. Something was coming. The moment that would decide everything was already on its way, hidden in the next heartbeat, waiting to test his soul in front of the whole world. And as the bells rang again across the Vatican, Marcus stood frozen in his place, unaware that destiny was already watching him. The ceremony continued under the bright Roman sun, and St. Peter's Square seemed to glow like gold. Choir voices rose and fell in perfect harmony, blending with the sound of bells. The air smelled of incense and old stone. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the Pope as he began his speech, his voice calm, echoing through the microphones. But Marcus Steiner's mind was not calm. He stood among the long row of Swiss guards, but his thoughts were far away, trapped between the rules he had sworn to follow and the deep emotion he couldn't suppress. He tried to breathe slowly, to stay focused on his duty. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, his gaze kept drifting toward the front of the crowd. The nun was still there, the same frail woman who had once rescued a lost boy from death. Sister Helena. She looked thinner now, her face pale like marble, her small hands clutching the edge of her blanket. Every few moments she smiled softly, as if she was praying silently for everyone around her. Marcus wanted to believe she didn't recognize him, but deep inside, he knew she did. Her gaze was calm but knowing. He swallowed hard, forcing himself not to move. Every instinct in his body told him to stay still. but his heart beat louder than the drums that marked the ceremony's rhythm. He remembered her voice again, gentle, warm, steady, saying, "Kindness will always be stronger than fear." He had heard those words in his mind countless times during his training, especially when things got difficult. And now, in this sacred moment, they felt like a message from long ago returning to him. The Pope continued speaking about peace and compassion, about unity and faith. Marcus listened faintly, but his eyes betrayed him again. Sister Helena was adjusting something on her lap. Her flag had fallen. A young pilgrim beside her, perhaps a volunteer, bent down to pick it up, but she waved him off kindly and tried to lift it herself. Her hands trembled. Marcus saw her struggle, saw how her breathing looked uneven, and something inside him twisted painfully. He looked straight ahead again, pretending nothing had happened. The rules were absolute. Swiss guards must never break formation, not even if the heavens fell. They must not react to anything, not a cry, not a sneeze, not a scream. They were to remain pillars of discipline, no matter what. He had seen men punished for as little as scratching their nose during official ceremonies. He couldn't afford that mistake, not in front of the world. But as the minutes passed, his uneasiness grew stronger. The air felt heavier, the sun hotter. He could feel sweat forming under his helmet, running down the side of his face, but he dared not move. Still, his thoughts kept racing. He remembered the night Sister Helena found him in the snow. How she had wrapped him in her shawl, how she had smiled and said, "You'll be all right, little one. The world is still kind." That was the night he began to believe in goodness again, and now she sat there, old and frail, almost forgotten by time, the same woman who had once carried him to safety. A strange ache filled his chest. He wanted to thank her. He wanted to kneel and tell her that he had kept her words, that he had become strong because of her. But all he could do was stand silently while she struggled just a few meters away. The ceremony reached its midpoint. The cardinals stood in lines, and the air filled with sacred hymns. Marcus tried to focus on the rhythm of the chants, using them to calm his nerves. For a while, he managed to push the memories away. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Sister Helena's wheelchair shift. A small movement at first, so small he thought it was his imagination. But then it happened again. Her chair rolled slightly forward, the front wheel catching on a crack between the cobblestones. She tried to stop it with her hands, but she wasn't strong enough. Marcus's heart jumped. The slope of the courtyard was gentle, but enough that the chair could move on its own if it lost balance. The boy beside her was distracted, turning to look at the choir. Marcus could see everything in perfect detail. Her shaking hands, the wheels turning slowly, her mouth opening slightly as she tried to call for help. He felt panic rising in his chest. His mind screamed for him to stay still. His training repeated in his head like a command. You do not move. You do not speak. But his heart said something else. His heart said, go. That time seemed to slow. He could hear nothing. Not the choir, not the crowd, not even his own breath. He watched as the wheelchair tipped a little more, the right wheel lifting off the ground. Sister Helena's body shifted forward. She was going to fall in that instant. Marcus made a choice. Without thinking, he dropped his halberd. The sound of the metal hitting the marble echoed like thunder. Heads turned instantly. He stepped out of line, breaking the perfect formation of guards that had stood unchanged for centuries. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras swiveled. Reporters shouted. Marcus ran the few steps between himself and the front barrier, moving faster than anyone could react. The guards around him stared in disbelief, frozen between confusion and fear. He reached the wheelchair just as it began to tip forward, his hands grabbing the handles, steadying it firmly. Sister Helena blinked in surprise, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. It's all right, Marcus said softly. his voice barely audible under the roar of whispers spreading through the square. "You're safe." The nun looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, her hand reached out and touched his arm. A tear rolled down her cheek as she whispered, "You kept your heart, my boy." Marcus stood there, still holding the chair steady, his heart pounding. He could hear murmurs all around, guards whispering, cardinals looking on in shock, the crowd buzzing with confusion. He knew what he had done. He had broken one of the oldest rules in Vatican history. He had left his post during a papal ceremony, but when he looked down and saw Sister Helena smiling weakly, gratitude shining in her tired eyes, he felt no regret. For a moment, everything stopped. The choir fell silent. Even the Pope, standing at the altar, turned to see what had happened. His gentle eyes studied Marcus, then shifted to the elderly nun in the wheelchair. The crowd waited, expecting anger or punishment. The commander of the Swiss Guard looked pale, unsure whether to shout or salute. Marcus took one step back, standing tall beside Sister Helena, unsure of what to do next. His breath was uneven. The halberd lay a few feet behind him on the ground, shining under the sunlight. He thought his career was over. He had disobeyed orders in front of the entire Vatican and the watching world. But then the Pope smiled. It was small at first, just a faint curve of kindness. He raised his hand, and the murmurs fell quiet. The Pope's voice, calm and warm, echoed through the speakers. "Let no one scold this man," he said, "for compassion is the truest form of duty." The crowd erupted into applause. The sound rolled through the square like a wave. Tears filled Marcus's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away before anyone could notice. He stepped back into his place, picked up his halberd, and stood tall again. His heart still raced, but his spirit felt light, lighter than it had in years. Sister Helena smiled and folded her hands in prayer. She looked at him one last time, and in her soft gaze, Marcus saw the reflection of everything he had learned: kindness, courage, and grace. He stood silently once more, but now his silence was different. It was not empty obedience. It was peace. As the Pope continued his blessing, the Vatican Square shimmered with something beyond ritual. It shimmered with humanity. And though no one knew it yet, that moment, that single act of compassion, would soon travel far beyond Rome and become a story told across the world. The sound of applause echoed through St. Peter's Square, rising like a wave that washed over the ancient walls of the Vatican. For a moment, Marcus Steiner stood frozen, his halberd in his hand once again, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the crowd. He could still feel the weight of Sister Helena's trembling hand on his arm. The warmth of her touch had reminded him of a time when kindness had saved his life. And now, in front of thousands of people, he had returned that kindness, even if it meant breaking the most sacred rule of his duty. Around him, the other guards still stood motionless, their discipline unbroken. But Marcus could feel the shift in the air. The crowd's applause was not just for the Pope. It was for what they had just witnessed, a guard who chose compassion over protocol. Yet, despite the cheering, Marcus's thoughts were filled with dread. He knew what he had done. The Swiss Guard's code was strict, unbending, and centuries old. He had abandoned his post during a ceremony of the highest importance. No matter what the reason, the punishment could be severe. Still, he kept his eyes forward, his body rigid, trying to steady his breathing. The Pope continued his blessing, his calm voice carrying across the square. Marcus listened faintly, but his mind was still on the few seconds that had changed everything. He could replay them in perfect detail. The sight of Sister Helena's wheelchair tipping, his body moving before his mind could stop him. The shock on everyone's faces, the Pope's smile, and then that single sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. Compassion is the truest form of duty. That sentence echoed in Marcus's mind. It gave him courage, even as he braced himself for the consequences. After the final hymn, the ceremony drew to a close. The Pope was escorted back into the basilica, the cardinals following behind. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their voices buzzing with talk of what they had just seen. Marcus stood at attention, waiting for the signal to stand down. When it came, he marched in formation with the others, his face calm though his stomach churned. The moment the last of the guests had left the square, Marcus felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Captain Lutz, his immediate superior, a tall man with a stern face and a reputation for following every rule to the letter. The captain's expression was unreadable as he whispered, "Steiner, report to the commander's office, now." Marcus nodded silently and began walking. The marble hallways of the apostolic palace felt colder than ever. The echoes of his boots followed him, each step heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The faces of passing guards and clerics were unreadable, some curious, some sympathetic, others disapproving. He had become the center of attention, though not in the way he had ever wished. When he reached the commander's office, he paused for a moment before knocking. His hand hesitated. Then he took a deep breath and entered. Inside, Commander Andreas Monkeller sat behind a wooden desk, his uniform spotless, his expression serious. He looked up as Marcus entered, his sharp eyes studying the young guard. "Sit," the commander said quietly. Marcus obeyed, keeping his posture straight, his eyes respectful but steady. "Do you understand what you did today?" The commander began. His voice was calm but firm. "Yes, sir," Marcus said, his tone low. "I left my post during the ceremony." "You did," the commander replied. "And you did it in front of the entire world. Cameras, journalists, dignitaries, the eyes of millions." He paused, leaning forward slightly. "Why?" Marcus hesitated. He could have said it was instinct. He could have said he panicked. But lying felt wrong. So he told the truth. "I saw an elderly nun in danger, sir. Her wheelchair began to slip. She would have fallen. I acted without thinking." The commander leaned back, silent for a long moment. "You broke the oldest rule in our history," he said finally. "But you also reminded the world what our service means." Marcus blinked, unsure how to respond. The commander's tone was not as angry as he had expected. "The Pope himself spoke in your defense," the commander continued. "He sent a message immediately after the ceremony. He said your action reflected the spirit of faith more than disobedience. His words have already reached the press." Marcus's eyes widened slightly. "The Pope spoke about me?" "Yes," the commander said, nodding slowly. "In his words, the guard who broke formation did not break faith. Those were his exact words." For a moment, Marcus didn't know what to say. Relief flooded him, but so did humility. He lowered his gaze. "I only did what felt right," he said softly. The commander studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You did, Steiner. And though I must still report this formally, I suspect there will be no punishment. You may have broken protocol, but you reminded us all why we serve, to protect life, not only ceremony." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, sir." The commander gave a faint smile. "Rest for today. You've made history, whether you wanted to or not." When Marcus stepped outside the office, the air felt lighter. He walked through the long halls, sunlight spilling through the high windows. A few guards nodded to him as he passed, small, silent signs of respect. Some even smiled slightly. He walked out into the courtyard and saw Sister Helena sitting near the colonnade. She had been allowed to rest there while Vatican staff arranged transportation for her. She looked peaceful, the sunlight touching her silver hair. When she saw Marcus approaching, her eyes brightened. "You," she said softly, her voice thin but full of warmth. "You grew tall." Marcus smiled gently and knelt beside her wheelchair. "You remember me?" How could I forget? She said with a small laugh. The little boy who tried to feed birds before himself. Marcus laughed softly too, though his eyes glistened. You saved my life, sister. I owe everything to you. She shook her head. No, my boy. God saved you. I just found you first. They both sat quietly for a moment, the world around them busy and loud, but that small corner of the Vatican seemed calm. Marcus looked at her wrinkled hands resting on the blanket and said, When I joined the guard, I thought duty meant silence and rules. But today, I think I finally understood what you meant all those years ago. She smiled knowingly. Duty is good, she said softly, but love gives it meaning. He nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. The same words she had taught him as a child. The words that had come back to him in the moment he chose to move. Few Vatican staff members approached to help her into a small vehicle. Marcus stood and saluted her in the traditional way, his expression solemn but kind. She reached out and patted his arm gently. I am proud of you, Marcus, she said. You kept your promise to the light. As she was taken away, Marcus stood still, watching until the car disappeared through the gates. The crowd had gone. The square was quiet again, but the memory of that moment would never fade. That evening, as the sun set over Rome, Marcus returned to his quarters. He sat on his small bed, removed his helmet, and stared at the metal pinned to his chest. It had never felt as heavy before. He realized now that it didn't just represent service. It represented heart. Outside. The city glowed golden, and the church bells rang again. Somewhere beyond the walls, people were still talking about the guard who broke protocol. But Marcus didn't care about fame or stories. He cared that Sister Helena was safe. He cared that he had done the right thing. And though he would face questions, headlines, and attention in the days ahead, he would face them with calm. Because he had learned something that day, that rules may guide men, but compassion gives them purpose. The sun began to set behind the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, painting the sky with colors of orange and gold. The Vatican was slowly returning to calm after the long day of the Pope's inauguration. Pilgrims were leaving the square. Reporters were packing up their cameras, and the sound of church bells echoed gently through the evening air. But inside the walls of the Vatican, one man's name was being whispered again and again. The Swiss guard, who had broken protocol in front of the entire world. Marcus Steiner sat alone on a bench in the courtyard, his helmet resting beside him. The events of the day replayed in his mind like a film he could not stop watching. Every small detail returned, the moment the wheelchair began to roll. The sound of his weapon striking the marble, the shock on the faces around him, and the warm smile of the Pope that had stopped the whole square from turning against him. He looked down at his gloved hands, the same hands that had reached out to help Sister Helena. He felt no regret, only a quiet sense of peace. Still, deep inside, he wondered what would come next. Even though the commander had told him that the Pope had spoken kindly of his action, Marcus knew that not everyone would agree. Rules were rules, and some men valued rules more than compassion. He could already sense that debates were happening behind closed doors. Some officers would defend him. Others would not. But Marcus was calm. He had done what he believed was right, and no punishment could take away that truth. As night fell, the Vatican lights flickered on. Marcus returned to his small room inside the barracks, a place so simple it barely felt like home. A single bed, a wooden table, a small cross on the wall. He took off his uniform slowly and sat in silence. The silence felt heavy but peaceful. He thought about Sister Helena, wondering if she had already been taken to her convent or a nearby hospital. He hoped she was safe. A soft knock came at the door. Marcus stood quickly, thinking it might be the commander again. But when he opened the door, it wasn't an officer. It was Father Louis, the the gentle old priest who often guided the guards in prayer before big ceremonies. The priest smiled kindly. "You've had quite a day, my son." Marcus nodded quietly. "Yes, Father." The priest stepped inside, his eyes full of calm understanding. "The world is talking about you," he said softly. "But I wanted to talk to you not as a soldier, but as a man." Marcus sat while the priest took a seat opposite him. Father Luis continued, "When you acted today, many saw a man breaking rules. But I saw something different. I saw someone choosing love over fear." Marcus looked down, his voice quiet. "I only did what anyone would have done, Father. She was falling. I didn't even think. I just moved." The priest smiled. "Sometimes not thinking is the purest form of faith. You didn't think, because your heart already knew what was right." Marcus felt warmth rise in his chest. The priest's words brought him comfort. Father Luis stood and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You should rest. Tomorrow will bring questions and cameras. But remember this, one act of kindness can speak louder than centuries of ceremony." The priest left quietly, and Marcus lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about that sentence again and again. One act of kindness can speak louder than centuries of ceremony. He didn't know how true that would become. The next morning, the Vatican was filled with reporters. Newspapers from around the world had already printed the story with bold headlines. "Swiss Guard breaks protocol to save elderly nun." Photos of Marcus holding the wheelchair filled television screens and social media feeds. People called him a hero, though he never saw himself that way. As he walked through the corridors that morning, other guards nodded respectfully. Some even smiled. Marcus returned the gestures with modest humility. He could tell that the world outside the Vatican walls was looking at him differently now. Before noon, he was called to a special meeting in the Pope's private office. His heart raced as he walked through the long marble halls, his boots clicking softly. Two other guards opened the large wooden doors for him, and he stepped inside. The room was quiet and bright, sunlight pouring through tall windows. Pope Leo XIV sat behind a simple wooden desk, wearing plain white robes instead of the ceremonial ones from the day before. His face was calm, his eyes kind and full of wisdom. "Ah, Marcus Steiner," the Pope said with a gentle smile. "Please, come closer." Marcus bowed respectfully, unsure what to say. The Pope gestured to a chair. "Sit, my son." Marcus hesitated, then sat slowly. The Pope studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know, the world has already judged what you did yesterday," he said. "Some say it was wrong. Others say it was noble. But I say it was human, and that makes it sacred." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "Your Holiness, I never meant to bring attention to myself. I only saw someone in danger." The Pope nodded. "Yes, and that is why you did not act wrongly. You followed the greatest commandment, to love and protect. There is no rule above that." For a few seconds, silence filled the room. The Pope then stood and walked to the window, looking out at the square below. "Tradition gives us order," he said softly, "but compassion gives us purpose. You reminded us all of that truth." He turned back toward Marcus, his smile warm. "You have served with courage, but yesterday you served with heart. And that is a gift the Church can never teach. It must be felt." Marcus could feel tears burning behind his eyes, but he kept his composure. The Pope stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You will not be punished. Instead, I wish to honor what you did. But your greatest reward, I think, is already within you." Marcus bowed his head. "Thank you, Your Holiness. I only did what she once did for me. She saved me when I was a child." The Pope's expression softened. "Then it seems God allowed two lives to meet again for a reason." After a few quiet moments, the Pope dismissed him with a blessing. "Go, Marcus. Keep guarding not only walls but hearts. When Marcus stepped out of the office, he felt lighter than he had in years. The sunlight seemed brighter, the air warmer. He walked out into the courtyard, where other guards greeted him with smiles and firm handshakes. Later that afternoon, he learned that Sister Helena had been taken to a nearby convent hospital to rest. Without waiting for permission, Marcus requested to visit her after his shift. The commander agreed quietly, saying only, "Go. I think you've earned it." When Marcus arrived, the small hospital garden was peaceful. Birds sang in the olive trees, and the soft wind carried the scent of flowers. Sister Helena sat by a fountain, her wheelchair beside her, her hands folded in prayer. When she saw Marcus approach, her face brightened with a smile that could melt even stone. "You again," she said warmly. "They told me you became quite famous." Marcus smiled shyly. "I never wanted fame, sister. I just wanted to make sure you were safe." She chuckled softly. "I was safe the moment you ran to help me. You see, you didn't break rules. You followed your heart. That's what faith truly is." They talked for a long time that afternoon, about the past, the monastery, and the paths their lives had taken. Marcus told her how he had joined the guard to serve, to repay the kindness she had once shown him. She listened with tears in her eyes. Before he left, she held his hand and said, "Promise me something, Marcus." "Anything." "Sister," he said softly, "promise me you'll never let the uniform silence your humanity." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I promise." As he walked back to the Vatican that evening, the city lights shimmered on the cobblestones. The sound of bells drifted through the air once more, soft and steady. He felt peace in his heart, knowing that his act of compassion had not been a mistake. It had been a calling. Inside the Vatican walls, word of the Pope's meeting spread quickly. People whispered that the Holy Father himself had praised the young guard's courage. Some even said the Pope planned to mention the event in his next public address as a lesson in mercy. Marcus didn't think about that. He wasn't chasing glory. He simply walked through the courtyard, looking up at the night sky, feeling thankful. The stars shone above the dome, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt truly at peace. He had protected the Pope's ceremony, yes, but more than that. He had protected what mattered most, the heart of compassion that faith was meant to keep alive. Morning sunlight touched the marble pillars of the Vatican, painting the courtyard in shades of gold and white. A new day had begun, quiet and calm, but the whole world was still talking about what had happened 2 days earlier. News channels replayed the moment again and again, the Swiss guard dropping his weapon, breaking formation, and saving the old nun before the Pope himself smiled and blessed his action. Reporters called it the day kindness broke silence. For Marcus Steiner, the young guard who had acted out of instinct, it all still felt like a dream. He had returned to his daily duties, though the atmosphere around him had completely changed. Where once his fellow guards had kept their distance, now they looked at him with respect. Some even came to him quietly and said, "You did what we all wish we could do." Marcus would only smile and shake his head, saying, "I only did what was right." Inside the Vatican, something subtle but powerful had shifted. People seemed more open, gentler in their tone. The Pope's short speech from the day before had echoed around the world. Faith is not a uniform to be worn. It is a heart to be lived. And though he had never mentioned Marcus by name, everyone knew who had inspired those words. That morning, Marcus walked through the quiet garden near the barracks. The birds sang softly among the trees, and the fountain sparkled under the rising sun. For the first time in many months, he allowed himself to stop and simply breathe. He thought about his journey, the lonely boy in the snow, the nun who had rescued him, the years of hard training, and the moment when he had chosen compassion over command. It felt as if his whole life had been leading to that instant. He sat on a stone bench near the garden wall and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he prayed, not because he was told to, but because his heart wanted to. He thanked God for letting him see Sister Helena again. He thanked him for the courage to move when he was supposed to stand still. And he prayed for the strength to always remember that duty without kindness was empty. As he prayed, he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, it was Commander von Keller. The man's tall frame and sharp posture still carried authority, but today his expression was softer. He stopped a few steps away and said, "You seem peaceful, Steiner." Marcus stood and saluted. "Trying to be, sir." The commander nodded and walked closer. "Do you know what I did last night?" he asked suddenly. Marcus shook his head. "I rewatched the recording," the commander said. "I wanted to see for myself what the world had seen." He paused, looking directly at Marcus. "And when I did, I realized something. We spend years teaching men to stand still, but we never teach them when it's right to move." Marcus was surprised by his words. The commander gave a faint smile. "The Pope told me yesterday that you reminded us all of what the Guard was created for, not just to protect the Holy Father, but to protect the spirit of compassion that lives within the Church." Marcus didn't know how to respond. "I'm honored, sir," he said softly. The commander nodded. "Good, because tomorrow His Holiness wishes to honor you personally in a small private ceremony inside the Apostolic Palace. No press, no cameras, just those who understand what truly happened that day." Marcus was speechless for a moment. "Me, sir? I don't deserve that." The commander smiled gently. "Perhaps not for breaking rules," he said, "but certainly for keeping faith." The next morning, the ceremony took place inside a quiet chapel deep within the Vatican. It was small, lined with golden candles and filled with the scent of fresh lily. Only a few people were present: the Pope, a handful of cardinals, Commander von Keller, and several guards. Marcus stood before them, his uniform pressed and spotless, his albert gleaming in his hand. The Pope entered slowly and smiled when he saw Marcus. "My son," he said warmly, "you have reminded us all that true strength lies not in stillness, but in compassion." He motioned for Marcus to step forward. "You did not just act to protect life. You acted to honor the heart of faith itself." Then the Pope held out a small medal, gold with the emblem of the Swiss Guard engraved upon it. "For courage guided by love," he said, placing it gently in Marcus's hands. Marcus bowed his head, his throat tight with emotion. He couldn't find words, so he whispered simply, "Thank you, Your Holiness." The Pope nodded and smiled. "Thank you, Marcus. You showed the world that mercy does not weaken discipline. It perfects it." The quiet room filled with gentle applause. Marcus felt overwhelmed, but in his heart, he knew the true reward had already been given: seeing Sister Helena safe, hearing her laughter again, and knowing he had done what she would have done. That afternoon, after the ceremony, Marcus went once more to the small convent hospital to see her. She was sitting in the garden again, surrounded by white flowers. Her face was peaceful, her hands folded in her lap. When she saw Marcus, her smile brightened. "So," she said teasingly, "the famous Guard returns." Marcus laughed softly. "I don't think I'll ever get used to that word." She chuckled. "Fame is a strange thing. It comes and goes, but kindness remains." He nodded and handed her a small box wrapped in a ribbon. "This is for you," he said shyly. She opened it and found a small silver cross inside, simple and beautiful. "It's from the Vatican workshop," Marcus explained. "They said it was made for someone who keeps faith alive in others. I thought that meant you." Her eyes filled with tears as she touched the cross. "You always had a gentle heart, even when you were a scared little boy," she said. "And you still do." They talked for hours, laughing at old memories. Marcus told her about his childhood dreams of serving in the Vatican, and she told him about the years she spent caring for others. When it was time for him to leave, she held his hand tightly. "Never forget," she said softly. "Rules are written by men, but love is written by God." "I'll remember," Marcus promised. He walked back through the city streets that evening, the air cool and calm, the bells of the Vatican ringing in the distance. Tourists were still gathered outside the gates, talking about the guard who had acted out of heart. Some took photos of the square, some prayed quietly, and Marcus walked among them unnoticed, blending into the crowd. He liked it that way. As he crossed the square, he stopped and looked up at the grand dome shining under the sunset. The same place where he had once stood frozen in duty now felt alive with meaning. The memory of that moment, of Sister Helena's fall, of the Pope's forgiving smile, of the crowd's applause, all played in his mind like a soft melody. He stood there quietly for a long time, then whispered a small prayer of gratitude, not for the recognition or the honor, but for the lesson that had changed his life. He had learned that faith wasn't about never breaking rules. It was about knowing when to follow the voice of the heart. Years later, people would still talk about that day. Pilgrims would point to the spot in the square and say, "That's where the Swiss Guard moved." The Vatican would even keep a small photograph of the moment in its archives. Under a title chosen by the Pope himself, the day Compassion stood guard. As for Marcus, he continued to serve quietly, never seeking attention. He remained a soldier, but a different kind, one who understood that the strongest armor was kindness, and the truest discipline was love. And every now and then, when the sunlight hit the square just right, he would look toward the crowd and remember the frail old nun who once saved him, and whom he, in turn, had saved. He would smile softly to himself and whisper, "Thank you, Sister Helena. You taught me that faith moves more than just hearts. It moves men." And somewhere in the quiet peace of the Vatican, he knew she was smiling too.